Welcome, Kasra Aarabi.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us at the Center for Liberal Modernity. Kasra is the program lead of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, where he specializes in Iran and Shia Islamist extremism. And he's also a non-resident scholar of the Middle East Institute in Washington. I'm very much intrigued to talk about the Iranian Revolution, the domestic protests starting last year. I think we all have been very much excited about this democratic uprising. And together with Ukraine, Iran is now on the forefront at the battle between democracy and authoritarian regimes. But given our limited time frame, the focus of our conversation will be the role of Iran in the context of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and the response of the West. So let's start with the first question. When the UN General Assembly voted on the resolution condemning Russia's war against Ukraine, Iran abstained. And the government published some statements calling for peace and diplomatic solution. Obviously, the regime wants to create an image of neutrality and moderation. But at the same time, we have strong indications of Iranian support for Russia's war, in particular delivering drones, ballistic missiles, and ammunition to the Russian army. So how far is Iran involved in the war, and how far is Tehran taking sides with Moscow?
Sure, I think it's important to start, first of all, by saying, just as other totalitarian regimes, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Islamic Republic operates as its propaganda arm, operates as the regime's propaganda arm globally. It does not reflect the true foreign policy of the Islamic Republic. So think of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and them on the international stage as being propagandists, because that's what they are. We see this in other totalitarian regimes, such as that of Putin's regime. Now, the Islamic Republic, in particular the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, is heavily involved in the Ukraine war, in supporting Putin's regime. The Islamic Republic, Khamenei's regime, is now the biggest military supporter of Putin in Ukraine. This relationship first began as a limited tactical kind of cooperation. But Ayatollah Khamenei, the 84-year-old supreme leader who has ruled over Iran for more than 3 decades, sees this opportunity as a moment to deepen the relationship with Moscow in what he believes is a clash of civilization with the West. This is very civilizational for Khamenei, similar to Putin. He believes that this is a clash of civilizations and it is a war against liberal values. So we see that this relationship is deeper than simply a marriage of convenience. It's about ideas. It's about hostility to not only the West, but precisely those liberal values and the liberal international rule-based order. As a result, we've seen that as the conflict has gone on, the relationship has become much more deeper. Military cooperation has become much more deeper. We've seen out that the IRGC in Iran's regime has set up warehouses, ammunition warehouses inside of Russia to produce Iranian weapons to be transported to the front line in the war in Ukraine.
Are there Iranian military specialists also engaged in Russia or in the occupied territories?
We have reports that IRGC has been deployed to support and provide assistance in terms of training. This isn't unprecedented, by the way. We've seen IRGC do this in Europe before during the Bosnian conflict in the 1990s. We're seeing also the Russians provide technology to the Islamic Republic, to Khamenei's regime, in terms of missile technology, in terms of satellite technology. And now it's no longer unforeseeable that we will see cooperation between the IRGC, the Wagner group. And that is really, really significant, because just to put this into context, Khamenei's regime believes the Western order is in collapse. And it is intent, and genuinely believes that, by the way. They genuinely believe the Western...
This is what they have in common with Putin and Xi Jinping.
Absolutely. They believe that they are in... Khamenei believes he's in an ideological troika with Putin and Xi Jinping. Whether China subscribes to this is neither here or there. We'll have to wait and see. But Putin and Khamenei certainly subscribe to this. And because they think the Western-led order is collapsing, because they believe the liberal order is collapsing, their intent to speed this up. Now that leads to strategic errors, that will lead to recklessness, that will lead to miscalculations. Their full support for Putin's war in Ukraine says it already has begun. This recklessness has already begun. And it's a very, very worrying trend. I think we're going to see this escalate to another level. I should also say, the response to Khamenei's regime's involvement in the Ukraine war by the Europeans, by the Americans, has not been sufficient. Putin's regime is using the Islamic Republic as a means to evade sanctions.
Before we are coming back to the topic of Western sanctions and Western response to Iran's engagement in Russia's war, what does the Syrian experience tell us? Both about the emergence of the Russian-Iranian cooperation and the fault lines of Western policies.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very, very important question, because this began really in Syria, this cooperation, this military cooperation began in Syria. It was Qasem Soleimani, former IRGC Quds Force commander, who only weeks after the European and the Americans had signed the nuclear agreement with Tehran, only weeks after, he broke a UN travel ban, went to Moscow and pleaded to Putin to intervene in Syria. A few weeks later, Putin started providing air support to IRGC militias, suppressing brutally and violently shutting down the Syrian revolution. Syria was in many ways a training ground, both for Khamenei's regime and for Putin's regime. But it wasn't just a training ground. It was a means to test Western appetite. Will we suffer consequences for our actions? The Syrian experience, despite the fact that the Assad regime used chemical weapons against his own people, the Syrian experience proved to Khamenei and Putin that there would be no consequences for their actions. As a result, neither Khamenei nor Putin fear consequences. That's what in part led to the invasion of Ukraine. Now the Europeans and the Americans have come together, and they've done so very well in relation to Ukraine. But in relation to the Islamic Republic of Iran, that does not exist. As a result, Khamenei still is intent and believes that his actions will go without any consequences.
So what is your assumption, your explanation for this hesitancy of the West to respond firmly to Iran's involvement in the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine and challenging the West by this kind of authoritarian alliance? Why are Western governments shying away, in particular, from declaring the Islamic Revolutionary Guard to a terrorist organization?
I've actually published on this, and I think the same three factors that led the West to miscalculate Putin are resulting in the West miscalculating Khamenei's regime and his intent. The first is disinformation. The Iranian regime, like Putin's regime, is at the forefront of spreading disinformation. It has regime propagandists across both the US and Europe. We know this. There was one prosecuted by the FBI, an agent who was prosecuted by the FBI for receiving payments from the regime in Iran for spreading disinformation. We've seen the same in relation to Putin's regime, pre-invasion of Ukraine. So the first one is listening to regime propagandists. The second is the idea that they share the same worldview and the same rationality as us in the West, which I always find quite amusing, because it's quite clear that this totalitarian, misogynistic regime that kills women for showing a bit of hair, that executes gay people on the basis of moral grounds, they clearly do not share the same rationality and the same ideals and values as us in the West. Putin made his views very, very clear in relation to Ukraine. Just a year before, he wrote that 15,000-word article outlining that he saw it as part of Russia. But as soon as he did that, we labelled that as being just for domestic consumption. He wouldn't invade, we said, because it would be irrational. And when he did invade, we said he was mad. We are repeating the same mistake with Khamenei. When Khamenei says Israel should not exist and we want to eradicate what he calls the Zionist regime,
we should take him seriously.
We should take him seriously. It's not for domestic consumption. If it was, why is he spending billions of dollars arming Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad to the teeth?
And developing the nuclear program.
Absolutely. So we should take them seriously and understand that they have a different worldview to us. And the last thing is selective hearing. Garry Kasparov in 2014 warned that Putin would invade Ukraine. And when he did, he was labelled a warmonger and a hawk. Putin did invade Ukraine. We are making the same mistakes with the Islamic Republic. We're being very selective in our hearing, and I think we need to assess the past 30 years. Can the regime reform? The answer is no. The Iranian people have made that clear, no. We saw the most brutal suppression under the so-called reformists. 1,500 civilians got killed in just a few days. The Islamic Republic cannot be reformed, and those three factors, I think, led us to miscalculate Putin. It's not too late to change and produce policy to weaken the suppressive forces that not only are killing Iranians, not only are they killing people in the Middle East, they are now killing people in Europe, namely the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They must be proscribed.
So in terms of practical political consequences, what would you suggest? What should the West do now regarding the Iranian regime?
I think first of all, we need to take a step back and say we need a policy that separates the regime from the people. We need a policy to target the Islamic Republic and weaken its suppressive forces that are not only killing Iranians, as I said, but destabilizing the global world order. And we need a policy to empower the Iranian people. So distinguish between those two policy issues first. How can we weaken the suppressive forces that are responsible for terrorism inside of Iran and outside of Iran? Well, we target the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard. Why is this important? Those opponents claim that the IRGC is sanctioned, so the terror designation is just symbolic. It's not. And here's why. In the past year, the IRGC has had a tactical doctrinal shift, where they're focused on nurturing homegrown Islamist extremism in Europe, similar to the tactics used by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Through the dissemination and propagation of violent Islamist extremist content, they are seeking to radicalize European citizens with the goal of radicalizing them for them to then carry out attacks, similar to what we saw in relation to Salman Rushdie. The terrorist who conducted the attack on against Salman Rushdie was engaging with IRGC Islamist extremist propaganda. They have been quite open that this is their strategy. They've said that we no longer need to send IRGC members to terrorize individuals like Bolton or Pompeo when we have zealous youth who we can work on in Europe and in America to do that for us. Current sanctions against the IRGC do not prohibit the dissemination of IRGC, violent Islamist extremist propaganda. So government so far does not have the power to ban that. That would change with terror legislation. Terror legislation prescribing the IRGC as a terrorist group, treating them no differently to Hezbollah. Germany's designated Hezbollah, rightly so. If Germany has designated Hezbollah, then it must designate Hezbollah's founder, the IRGC. It was Hezbollah was created by the IRGC. The IRGC is its biggest military, ideological, and financial supporter. If Hezbollah's on the list, the IRGC has to be too.
So thanks for this clear analysis and political messages. To conclude, I would say the West should not repeat its naivete and ignorance towards Russia's imperial agenda and readiness to wage war now with respect to Iran, and we have to take these two adversaries together for a combined strategy to defend the international liberal order.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.